Ooh, Wonder Man. Let's have a conversation about Wonder Man. Now, most people they went into Wonder Man expecting your classic cliche superhero story. But what they got instead was something far more truthful, something far more honest, something far more uncomfortable. Because this show wasn't about powers, it wasn't about villains or spectacle. It was really about identity under pressure. It's about what happens when who you are becomes a liability in the world you are trying to succeed in. Everything about the themes of this show hit me really hard because of that. It's also about quiet violence. Well, the quiet violence of having to conceal parts of yourself just to be seen as acceptable. Wonder Man uses Hollywood, performance, and power as symbols, not plot devices. They use these things as symbols to explore something that the MCU hasn't fully confronted yet. And that's a world that fears difference more than destruction. Now, this breakdown isn't about Easter eggs for the sake of trivia. It's about the underlying language of the show, the masking, the thresholds or the gateways, the absence of a traditional villain, and why this series is secretly preparing us for the Mutant Saga. Because if you're watching this very closely, Wonder Man isn't asking, what can this character do? It's asking something that is much more dangerous. What does it cost him to exist as himself? Now, this is going to hit heavy, but let's get into this breakdown of the show Wonder Man. So, shout out to Jaha, right? Jaha Abdul Mateen II. I hope I said that right. Because the brother is a phenomenal actor. I loved him in Candyman. He was the Mantis in Aquaman. He was also Mr. Manhattan in Watchmen. Fucking phenomenal show. Okay, that's my favorite thing I've seen him in. He was also Morpheus in the Matrix Revolutions, right? So he has a very solid catalog. The brother can act. He's a very, very gifted actor. I'm so happy to see him in the MCU. So get your Disney and your MCU bag, bro. I'm happy to see it. Now, we should expect to see him in Avengers Doomsday, I believe. I'm not sure. But I hope we see a whole lot more of this character. Now, let's get into Wonder Man. So there's so many things that we can touch on in this show, right? Now let's just look at the core symbolism of it, which is the mask that we wear. Because at the heart of Wonder Man, you have identity versus self-concealment, literally and metaphorically. Because you have Simon Williams, he hides his true nature, his true superpowers in order to protect his career, even while chasing his artistic destiny. Now, this is a very deep theme to me. And it's a deep theme of concealing one's power in order to fit into a world that fears, misunderstands, or suppresses it. So this is classic esoteric psychology where the true self must be veiled or hidden in order to survive collective norms. So this whole sense is how you get when you deal with the whole mutant saga. Now, for those of you who are comic book, familiar with the comic books, you know that this is taking a very different route. I'm personally always okay with it. I don't feel like I need the story exactly the way it was originally written. I don't need it that way if someone's going to do it over if they're going to do their own version. It's like giving your own rendition of a spell. It's like recasting, but you putting your spin on it. I'm not against that because most stories or lots of stories have similar themes, concepts, and plot lines. That's why so many movies look like the same story. So because it ultimately is about the themes that the story is addressing. So I'm not against that. It doesn't have to be totally, completely like the original source material. I'm not particularly one of those people. Now, for those people who are comic book familiar, they may be triggered by the fact of it seems like the MCU is leaning more towards Simon being a mutant. And I don't know why we are so upset with that, considering the fact don't nobody care about no Wonder Man. I ain't never heard none of y'all talk about no goddamn Wonder Man. Never in the capacity of the way we talking about it right now. So I feel like it's just something for people to complain about, for people who want to complain. Because there are some people in this world who are going to complain no matter what you do. You have to let them people be who they are. Amen. Just let them be what they are. So I can see how this storytelling is lining up with the whole Mutant Saga, because all throughout this series, we get this feeling or this sense of Simon's powers being a problem. You don't get things being a problem till you start to deal with the mutants. All right. So now, if we get back to the core symbolism, if we're talking about masks, now the mask is always symbolic of ego versus higher self. The ego adapts, it hides, it performs. The higher self, it expresses unfiltered power and authenticity because it's the higher self. Now, true integration is when the two are reconciled and not suppressed. And from a Black existential perspective, this also echoes the burden of performance under social gaze. This is something, as I said before, this is why this show should really hit hard for a lot of us as melanated people, because we understand what comes with that. We understand the necessity of having to perform in a society that has the capability of just ending your life without any consequence. So, being Black, we can understand the burden of performance under social gaze. We can understand the pressure to censor parts of yourself in order to be perceived as safe, acceptable, or sellable in dominant culture. This is what we call crossing over. This is what some people call selling out. So there's a certain way you must perform as a Black person to be seen as acceptable amongst the dominant culture. There's a powerful symbolic theme of Hollywood. Hollywood is playing as the great mirror throughout the show. It's not just a setting in Wonder Man, it's a metaphorical crucible, because Hollywood, in this sense, is a representation of the collective consciousness. So it represents the place where stories are projected, where myth is manufactured and consumed. So, especially when you understand the occult, you know cinema can be read as modern ritual theater that can oftentimes reinforce stereotypes or archetypes and collective illusions. So in the show, Hollywood rejects superpower actors through what's called the doorman clause, which was very well done, so to speak. Because not only in terms of it being the doorman, but you think about doorman and what a doorman does. A doorman guards the door, protects the door, is a threshold. So keeps certain people out and only allows certain people to come in. We're going to get more into that doorman episode, right? So Hollywood treats power itself as a liability, which mirrors how society oftentimes fears authentic self-actualization in favor of manageable narratives. So you see, Simon is not yearning for fame, but for the right to be seen as he truly is. That's why he said, I was born to play this role. You see, this parallels with esoteric teachings that say that the world fears the unmasked self, because unmasked power cannot be controlled or commodified. So if you're looking at this from an occult lens, which you very much need to understand when you're dealing with Hollywood, in that sense, Hollywood becomes the alchemical stage. This is where base metals, which is ego, insecurity, hunger, those things are projected as silver and gold, like status, image, fame, fortune. But those projections are illusions that ultimately have to be transcended. So while it's on my mind, let me talk about the doorman episode for a minute, because that was a very symbolic episode. It represents initiation. And oftentimes, initiation involves exclusion or being set apart. So there's a forced encounter with boundaries that can strip away illusions of belonging or comfort, right? So that doorman clause, Simon is actually prevented or barred from acting because of his power. So if the world finds out about his power, he can't do the one thing he truly wants to do, which is act. And most of the time when you're dealing with initiation lore, right, or stories or narratives around initiation that's themed about being initiated into something, most times the aspirant is often kept from what they desire most until they confront their inner blocks, which creates a very powerful metaphor. You cannot enter the world carrying your power unrefined. It's a threshold for self mastery. Now, Trevor Slattery. Now, a lot of people, some people bothered by the fact that they reinventing this character, right? But I'm not mad at it, and I understand it, because when you have somebody like Ben Kingsley on your call sheet, you gonna use Ben Kingsley because the man is an actor. He's an actor's actor. He don't play when it comes to acting. Whatever you see him in, he transforms into that role. And he played this role so well. And this isn't the start of the reinvention of the Mandarin character. But a lot of people don't follow as closely when it comes to MCU. Me personally, I done seen everything MCU. I watch all of it, right? Now they started the rebrand with him in the Shang-Chi, because they kept emphasizing how he didn't finish out his time in Wonder Man. Well, if you've seen Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings, then you know that he was broken out of prison by that crime syndicate that he was pretending to be the ruler of. The real the real crime lord, crime boss, right? So they broke him out to punish him for taking their whole organization global and making a mockery of it. So Trevor is the wise fool. He's the trickster archetype. So he provides this comic relief, but he's not just comic relief. That is an actual occult archetype. He embodies the fool, which is the figure that appears chaotic. He appears unaligned or maybe even unserious, but who reveals deeper truths through disruption. So every time you notice he comes in with some deeper truth or some wisdom that Simon really needs at the time. He really needs it at the time. So although he has this persona of just being this carefree actor or what have you, he really comes through with some gems in necessary times. And in many esoteric traditions, the fool is the initiate who just doesn't know that they're on a path, but they are living truth through experience rather than ceremony. So Trevor's dynamic with Simon reflects a deeper theme. It's the journey of the sword, which is Simon, being guided by the wanderer, which is Trevor, right? And Trevor is one whose scars and missteps are teaching devices for Simon. He uses these things to teach rather than to see them as failures. Now, again, this show is very relatable, especially from the Black lens, because in Black cultural experience, there's often a dual consciousness, right? The need to present a curated self in dominant spaces, which is white spaces, right? While preserving a powerful inner self that must be protected from harm. We know this as code switching, right? We know we can't be our real true self in them corporate environments or whatnot. That shit will scare white folks. So naturally, we grow up learning how to switch, how to code switch, how to put on masks, how to be what we need to be in those environments. Now, I will say I can't speak on the accuracy of the Haitian family. I don't know about that. They might have been a little off in terms of their accents or what have you, because I don't think the mother is an actual Haitian woman. I think she's British with Nigerian ancestry. And the brother is American. I seen him on stuff before. So I don't know to speak on the accuracy of the Haitian depiction. So I leave that alone. Although I do appreciate them putting a Haitian family in it though. And them making him Haitian in a sense of being inclusive, I guess, right? So I'm not mad at that. And that can layer into the storyline, because you gotta know, I've done a lot of work with people from the Caribbeans, people from Africa, right? So they are under extensive pressure a lot of times from their culture to succeed in America. So it's a even heavier layer, especially when you look at the third episode where he's dealing with his family and how everybody's dismissive of him, everybody look down on him, don't nobody respect him, everybody questioning what he do. Now, if you are artist or any type of creative or entrepreneur, that shit should really be relatable. It should really be relatable. But the black lens, that cultural experience, that dual consciousness is very necessary to point out here. You see, Simon's literal concealment of power mirrors the psychological survival strategy many black people have to navigate, withholding certain truths in order to remain safe or viable, encoding strength as humility or compliance. I know me personally, I'm always saying to my kids, it's certain things you don't say to certain people because we don't want certain people to come up in our house. That's just what we deal with as being the non-dominant culture in America. And I noticed a lot of people saying it felt similar to somebody trying to hide their sexuality if they might be a homo, somebody in the closet. And I can get that. I can understand that too, because it still connects. It's relatable in trying to hide something that is a huge part of who you are and how you identify, and having to keep that away. So it's not a coincidence he didn't have no friends. It's not a coincidence that he couldn't maintain a relationship because he can't share all of himself. At least that's how he feels. He feels like he can't share all of himself. So I can see the relation to that. This is why I've never had a problem with nobody that's in the LGBTQ plus community. How can I, as a black person, as a black woman, how could I ever be dismissive to their experience when I can totally understand their experience? Not just as a black person, but also as a black sheep. Being somebody who views things non-traditionally, I'm always feeling like I have to question what I'm sharing with who I'm sharing it with, or at least I used to. It's not relevant no more, but I can understand that before you get to the point of mastering who and what you really are. So the tension of this is not just social, this shit is spiritual. It's the initiate refusing to show power until the world is ready. And then discovering that the true transformation really just happened within. You don't need no consensus. One of the most powerful or most resonant layers in Wonder Man is the scene where you see young Simon watching the old Wonder Man movie with his dad, which becomes the seed of his lifelong dream. Because you must remember, movies are the modern mythic scripture. They give form to inner archetypes. Simon's encounter wasn't entertainment, it was spiritual imprinting. We're talking about a boy who's had abilities since he was 13. It was spiritual imprinting. It's like how a formative myth can shape destiny in psychology. His childhood experience became the anchor for his soul's purpose. And this mirrors the whole concept that symbol and story are doorways into the subconscious. And through them, the self is called to awaken. So when we look at this, understand Hollywood is an ego matrix, right? It's a matrix of projection, right? So actors play roles within roles, much like souls navigating mask in life. So Simon, as both actor and superpower being, is a meta figure. So meaning he's somebody who lives on both sides of the mirror. Outer performance and inner truth. His journey is symbolic of a very deeper path. He's going from his fragmented self as an actor to his embodied self of Wonder Man. So he's becoming Wonder Man in the sense of the actor, but also in the sense of his real life. It's not about hiding power, but about owning it in a world that fears what's authentic. So it's an alchemical story. There's an alchemical transformation. The blackening is Simon's struggles, his self-doubt, his rejection. The whitening is the bond that he established with Trevor that leads to his self-realization. Right? The yellowing is the growing wisdom about his craft and his identity, how he brings the two together. The reddening is owning his power and rewriting his narrative, which is what we get to at the end. If you notice, at the end, he has control over his powers. This is a symbolic arc that's showing you a spiritual transformation. It shows you turning lead into gold, literally. And I also want to mention how, right, he seems very coded for neurodivergency, possibly, right? But that just in a sense goes back to him being a mutant, right? And in a sense of him not having a lot of friends, him being socially closed off, his obsession with being an actor, right? So it gave that in a way as well. And a lot of neurodivergent people struggle with the same things because a lot of times they struggle with social cues and things like that. So when it comes to what's seen as normal or natural, for them, it may not be. So it's harder to share yourself with people. You see what I'm saying? It's a lot harder to do. Now, there was a key. Before I forget, I want to make sure that I do note that Wonder Man also seeded some other things and made some connections in other ways that opens the door for a lot of things that come through, like the Roxxon Corporation, right? And that's one of the most important things in the Marvel comics because what they symbolize is exploitative capitalism, corporate power feeding on people, land, and energy, right? This was how they showed you how Doorman got his powers, right? So in Wonder Man, their presence in the background is just reinforcing the theme that certain powers are more threatening, right? Authentic expression has to be regulated, right? So Cloak and Dagger, this opens the door possibly for a Cloak and Dagger introduction. It's a very subtle nod to them, even with the Doorman whole sense, right? Because you got Cloak and Dagger. If you're not familiar, they did do a Cloak and Dagger show on Hulu before. I wasn't too fond of that series, but they did do Cloak and Dagger, and it's a lot of potential in it, right? I will be very intrigued to see what MCU can do with it. I'm intrigued to see what MCU can do with everybody because they have the money and the production power to do things that most other studios can't do because it's Disney. I know how y'all feel about Disney. I know what suspicions we have and everything, but we're not talking about all that. We're just going to talk about the storytelling in this instance, in this sense. So whenever I see the possibilities that can come from MCU, it always does give me a sense of excitement because they can handle it. They can fail in ways other companies can't fail, and they can still keep things going. Now, I think personally, y'all been way too hard on MCU past recent years, and I think it's because there's a certain narrative in play, and because when you're dealing with the internet, you can really drive whatever narrative you want to drive. If you could just get enough bots to just push the same goddamn concept out there that you want to be pushed out there. And I think that's some shit that's just been pushed out there because of the success that comic stories often have. Now, I don't know why people have it out for these stories because they don't always traditionally do well. They haven't always done well. DC never does well. But we've seen MCU have these staggering numbers and people getting their feels and certain producers and writers and all that getting their feels. But hey, I'm going to tell you, like I said before, I respect the fuck out of comic book stories. Those the best stories because they are cult grounded foundational stories. They gonna give you spiritual truths you're not really gonna see as heavily or as symbolic as you're gonna see in comic book because it's a comic. Because it has a splash of imagination with it, right? So people tend to forget that nature of imagination. And so people always get into the realism of it, is if it's realistic or not. I'm not looking at a movie. I don't want to be fooled by a movie to think it's real. I don't want that. I don't want to watch a movie and grade it or debate about if this thing here is realistic or not. I don't want to do that. That's not the point of a movie for me. I'm looking at the actual story and the narratives and the symbolism and what the story is saying to my subconscious. I'm not looking at what's on the surface. 'Cause all that shit on the surface, the action, all that shit is on the surface. I want to look at what's deeper. So the Doorman episode is a very subtle nod to Cloak and Dagger, right? Their powers only work in unison, and it has to do with the dark dimension, right? So now, if I'm to move on, there were so many Easter eggs in this, right? And they were very purposefully placed as well. And whenever you're dealing with Easter eggs, they're not center stage, right? They're intentionally placed off where it is not necessary, or you're not obligated to need to see it to understand what's going on. It's just a nod to those who pay attention to detail. So Hollywood itself is framed as a veiled temple in this series. So it's a place of initiation. It's a place of illusion. It's a place where power is disguised as entertainment. When you look at occult symbolism, what is in the background is often more true than what's in the foreground. The initiate is meant to notice it and not be told. So those things placed in the background is not for the basic surface viewer. It's for the initiate. It's for those who know. So when you see the Roxxon logo, those offhand references, right? It's environmental storytelling. The show is saying, if you know how power works, you're going to see it everywhere. And this isn't about making this trivia. This just is about understanding symbolic patterns, right? And some of those Easter eggs carry that symbolism. So it was something that I did want to make sure that I touched on, because it's probably going to be very important in later MCU projects. So, right, be mindful of that. Now, the Mutant Saga. Right? Now, we said this seems to be a way to introduce the Mutant Saga, because mutants are never introduced as powers. They are always introduced as problems. Every time when you look at X-Men, right? If you watch the old little cartoon growing up, it's always about the government or the powers that be trying to control their power. So one of the biggest shifts coming from the Mutant Saga is that powers are not going to be looked at as gifts like your Iron Man or your Captain America. No, they are going to be framed as social disruptions. Because if you're familiar with anything in the comics or even in the old cartoons, X-Men and the Avengers used to get busy. So when we look at Wonder Man, Simon's abilities disqualify him rather than elevate him. Always before in the MCU, having powers was something that put you above everybody else. But in this instant, it disqualifies him, right? Also in Wonder Man, power becomes something that must be disclosed. It must be regulated and has to be hidden. And the fear isn't destruction, it's difference. It's all about mutants, because historically mutants have never been feared because they are violent. They were feared because they exist outside of permission. Their powers just turn on. Versus Captain America, he volunteered to get that serum. Iron Man built his shit, right? So Wonder Man is training the audience to feel this discomfort. It's creating this tension before the mutants arrive in mass with the MCU. So there's this shift from, or there's going to be, or I'm predicting there's going to be this shift from save the world to survive the world, because the Infinity Saga was asking, can we stop Thanos? The whole Mutant Saga is like, can you live honestly in a world that doesn't want you visible? So Simon's story is not about choosing good versus evil. It's about truth versus safety. That's the emotional backbone of most of mutant narratives. You got to hide who you are. You got to manage the perception. Deciding when being visible is worth the cost. This is why Wonder Man feels heavier, right? So Hollywood, in the sense of this show, is symbolizing mainstream society. So if you notice, power is allowed only if it's performative, right? Authenticity is threatening this system. This mirrors how mutants were always treated. They had to register. They had to be contained. It was assimilate or disappear. So this show is asking the audience to sit with this truth the world doesn't fear monsters, it fears uncontainable identity. This was the whole sense too of the Doorman episode. That's why they gave you the whole episode of Doorman to show you. This is why it's carrying on in the marketing, and you seeing the whole Josh Gad thing still being carried out in the promotion of the marketing, because we talking about mutants. So Simon Williams is appearing to be a bridge character. Now we can't definitively say he is a mutant because they're not saying it, and it's also not in the comic books that he was a mutant. In the comic books, Baron Zemo is how he got his powers. If you don't know Baron Zemo, you got to go back and watch Captain America. Which Captain America was it? Not Civil War, not the Winter Soldier. Which one was it with Baron Zemo? Actually, no. I'm tripping. Baron Zemo was actually Falcon and Winter Soldier, right? So if you saw Falcon and Winter Soldier series, the whole thing with the Baron Zemo. So with him doing the experimentations, right? But we don't know how they're going to lay this whole thing out, because they're writing this in their own way and introducing things. Because mind you, Disney did not acquire the rights to the X-Men until way after they started MCU, when they acquired Fox. So we got to keep these things in mind, right? Just like they had to go through what they had to go through in order to get Spider-Man, right? What they had to go through in order to get Hulk. There's a reason you haven't seen a Hulk solo movie. They don't have the rights to use Hulk in that fashion, right? So that's what we have to keep in mind as well, right? Things aren't just happening ideally, right? So we are looking at Simon as a bridge character. He's not labeled mutant, but he seems to be carrying mutant themes: unnatural strength, social exclusion, internalized fear of being seen. This is what you get predominantly when you're dealing with mutants, right? The pressure to downplay who he is. All this is intentional because Marvel is easing the viewers into a world where powers aren't rare, where difference is common, and where society reacts before heroes do. That's how you introduce mutants without exposition, so they know what they're doing. Now, this matters because mutant stories have always worked best when they mirror lived experience. The black lens, right? We're coming back to the black lens and how immediately aligns mask and code switching, hypervisibility and invisibility at once. Being told your presence is too much or a liability. Wonder Man isn't preaching this, but it damn sure lets you feel this. And that's because of this Mutant Saga thing, right? So they don't want it to become spectacle without psychology, or to be a metaphor without intimacy. That's a very big part of the whole mutant thing. There's a strong psychological element to it, right? So by the time mutants are going to be formally introduced, us as the audience will already understand why they're feared, why they're regulated, why they're divided. They're turning up the stakes because Wonder Man has shown you what happens when power enters a system built on image control, what happens when authenticity costs opportunity, and what happens when being whole is unprofessional. We saw the whole thing with Doorman. It's not a future setup, it's present conditioning. So they're not just introducing mutants, they're retraining the audience to stop asking, what can this character do? And to start asking, what is this going to cause them to exist? This is why this show is so amazing. And it's very foundational in the next phase. I'm glad they didn't do away with this show because we almost didn't get it. They almost wrote it off. So when you look at an enhanced human like a Steve Rogers, right, versus mutant, there's core differences, right? So enhanced beings like Captain America, even Hulk, they were made. They weren't born like that. Their power comes from experiments or accidents or technology. Look at Ant-Man, or external intervention. Permission was involved. There's permission there. Again, Steve volunteered. He was selected. He was approved by authority. He became a symbol the system could endorse. Even if we were to bring in Isaiah, if y'all paid attention to Captain America, to even it started with Falcon and Winter Soldier and went into Captain America Brave New World. You see how they treated Isaiah? Bro was a super soldier and went in and saved soldiers too, but they locked his ass up. You see, enhanced humans are acceptable power because it was authorized. It was explained and controlled. unless we are talking about Isaiah. That's a little bit different, right? But it reinforces the idea of, well, power is fine if we give it to you. We give you the power, right? But mutants, on the other hand, they fundamentally different. They born that way. Their power emerges naturally. Most of the time, it happens at puberty. So you got 12, 13-year-olds getting powers. There's no approval. There's no origin story that the system can manage. So mutants represent sovereign power, which is power that arises from within and it does not ask permission. This is why they fear mutants. Not because they're stronger, but because they break the social contract around who gets to be powerful. There's the key distinction that most people miss. The world doesn't fear destruction. It fears uncontrollable emergence. It fears power that cannot be licensed. This is why mutants symbolize or represent evolution without approval, difference without justification. They're living proof that power is not earned, that it emerges. And that terrifies the system that's built on control. Now, again, if you didn't see Captain America, Brave New World, you missed some things because they started to introduce a lot of things having to do with mutants there. And I'm loving how they making this connection because in the comics, the reason that there is an evolutionary alteration is because of the dead Celestial that altered the evolution of humans. So we go back to the Eternals. We get the dead Celestial, which isn't talked about anymore until you get to Captain America Brave New World. And in Captain America Brave New World, they start to talk about the adamantium, stronger than vibranium, right? It becomes a fight between the Japanese and the Americans and who gets to get the adamantium. Then we think about Wolverine with the adamantium, right? And the Celestial. So there is a dead Celestial in the MCU. Now, granted, in the comics, this happened a millennia or so ago, right? But we have to change that process in terms of how they're doing this. But I think it's phenomenal. Because again, I don't think you gotta follow that shit right and exact the way I don't think that. I don't think it has to be done that way to be a great story. And I feel like when people do that, man, you just want to complain. If you like the original sense, that's fine, just like that. But I don't think it has to take anything away from that, right? But that's just me. That's just how I see it. But if you paid attention to Captain America Brave New World, that it highlighted it in it. It brought it about in it. And that's also the introduction to the alternate realities because in the post-credit scene, they tell you about it. But so many people was in their feelings and didn't want to watch the movie, didn't want to support the movie. Nobody saw it. Because everything in the MC, everything isn't going to be like this. Going to be high level. Some shit is foundational and it's setting the stage. But we live in a society where don't nobody have no patience. People can barely get through a movie. If you don't catch their attention in the first 5 to 10 minutes, you probably lost them as a viewer and they're not going to understand shit. And they're going to say whatever it is bad because they didn't have the attention span to be able to pay attention to it. That's the world we live in. So media literacy is very much on the decline. So for those of us who appreciate good storytelling, I feel like we do have to speak up about those stories that don't meet the criteria of most of society because they don't have the attention span to stick with it. I don't feel like you need an explosion on the screen every 2 minutes just to pay attention. But that's just me. I'm saying that's just me. So if we was to look at this from an esoteric lens, we could say that mutants are the next octave of consciousness. Evolutionary initiates, humans whose nervous systems and perception exceed the current norm. So that's why mutant stores always center registration, containment, cures. They be saying, do you get a cure for their power? Or there's a school to manage them, Xavier and his school for the gifted. And it's basically just a way to protect those kids. Because the fear is never there to destroy the world. The fear is there to make the world obsolete. So mutants don't get treated like heroes. So on a human level, they can represent a lot across cultures, especially marginalized cultures. Most people are familiar with the story of Stan Lee saying he based Professor X and Magneto on the opposing views of those in the civil rights movement, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. It correlates. It makes sense. It truly makes sense, right? So in that sense, right, let's talk about some key moments that was in the show. Let's talk about that for a moment. Because while you watch it, there's so many things that's just gonna jump out to you when you watch it, right? I would love to actually do a watch party around this show, but I'm not starting the watch parties back up right now. But I will let you guys know when we will get back on those watch parties. But you notice all throughout the show, pardon me, y'all, I got a little cold. I'm still getting over it. But this is why we see Simon treated as a risk all of the time. He's treated as a risk and not a talent. His powers are problematic, and that was the instance of the very first scene. I feel like it was to show us how problematic he can be, even though it's very subtle, right? Studios and directors, it is in a sense of his liability, right? It's like he's subtly being asked to downplay who he is. And in moments where he has to magnify or exclusively show who he is, he struggles because he's not used to doing that. So he's often framed a certain way in professional spaces. And I feel like this matters because, again, power without permission is threatening. So it's in a sense to train the audience to understand Simon's conflict isn't villains. He's dealing with a system that fears what it cannot regulate. So again, we dealing with mutant logic, right? Simon's has a lot of almost moments. There's so many almost moments from auditions, meetings, and those industry spaces, right? He keeps getting close, but it doesn't land. And what we've learned through dialogue, his interaction with his family and whatnot, he's been doing this for 10 years, right? And he hasn't been able to really land anything. And it's not because he's bad, but a lot of it has to do with his own self-monitoring, because he's constantly thinking about how he's being perceived. He's trying to manage what parts of himself are being seen or are visible. He has to shrink his presence so he can feel safe. So I've been talking about being seen and a visibility wound. This is classic visibility wound behavior, because it's basically when being seen has felt unsafe or authenticity becomes fragmented, because again, since he was 13, he's had to hide who he is. So the show is showing us that it's not his talent that's making him fail. It's that fear of exposure. And if you watch that third episode, the Pacoma episode where he's going to his mother's birthday, the whole interaction with his family, with his brother. If you are a creative, an entrepreneur, if you are doing something that everybody is telling you you have no business doing, that you should not do, you're not good enough to do it, you should very much connect with this show. You should connect with it. And it's so sad, but it's so telling how nobody really triggers you like your family. Nobody really digs at you like the people that's known you all your life, bro. And it's mind-boggling how you can just want something so bad, how you can strive for something so much, and the people that's supposed to love you the most create the most self-doubt or can trigger the most self-doubt in you when they question who or what you are, or when they want to put you in a box of who they think you are supposed to be. But that was a very triggering episode to me. And I can understand why it was the instance where he lost his cool, where it had to erupt. Because nobody triggers you more than the people that's supposed to love you. And it was such a moment where we needed to really see the magnitude of his powers, because we haven't really been able to truly see it. And not only do we see it, but so does Trevor. Trevor sees it in this moment, because remember, he has been put in this position to get information on Simon having powers. He was sent by the Department of Damage Control. So he is supposed to be gathering evidence. But at the same time, he's also getting this bond with Simon, which was so symbolic. And they told us in the first episode when they met and when they were in the movie theater, and the movie they were seeing was it Midnight Cowboy? Ain't that's the name of that movie? Midnight Cowboy, I think is the name of it, but it's an old movie. But it's centered around an unlikely friendship, which is what we get, an unlikely friendship between Trevor and Simon. You see? So that doorman episode, let me revisit that for a minute. Because it's one of the most important episodes thematically in terms of theme, right? Because Simon is blocked entry. This is literally and figuratively or metaphorically, right? Because again, doormen are thresholds, guardians. They guard the door. So it's not about them stopping, or it's not about the unworthy not being allowed in. It's the unintegrated. Because Simon isn't integrated with himself. He's forced to confront how much he identifies with the limitation, how much he's leading with his wound instead of his whole self. Because this whole episode, it exposed a universal truth. You don't get access to new spaces while you still clinging to an old identity. That was a heavy thing in that episode. So when you get to the episode 6, where Trevor and Simon go to the director's house, they go to Kovac's house, right? Because he wants to see who they truly are underneath. He wants to make sure that he chooses the right people to play the parts. And a big part of it is, who are you underneath? Simon is struggling because he can't show you who he is underneath. Not really. He can't show you all of him because there is consequences if he does that, if he reveals his power and who and what he truly is. So there's the moment where Trevor gives him the pep talk. And this is the emotional and philosophical heart of the show. This was such a powerful moment when Trevor tells him, you're not just your abilities. You're not just your condition. You're not just your pain. You are the sum of your lived experience. And this really hits because most humans unconsciously believe people will only see the part of them that is hurt, will only see the pain. We tend to over-identify with that pain and it becomes our identity. And when that happens, we get so zero focused on that pain, we automatically think that this is what everybody else sees, but it's not. It's not the case at all. And Trevor breaks this spell for Simon. Because again, that over-identification with pain becomes a mask, right? Healing begins when the identity can expand again. And this scene reframes identity for Simon, not just for Simon, but for the audience. For anybody out there who's ever struggled with who they truly are and having self-doubt in being their authentic selves because they live in a world where the system doesn't truly allow you to be who you are without consequence. So this was such a very powerful moment in this show. And when I saw this scene, this was where I knew and I could feel the true depth of the show and what it was really doing. So it's a very powerful moment. Now I want to go back and revisit, Hollywood as a character and not a setting. Okay, it's very important we understand the role Hollywood is playing within the show itself. Not the setting of where it is, but what it is. And we can see this all throughout the show. Hollywood isn't neutral in the show. It functions as a mirror and as a judge, because it's basically, what version of you can we sell? That's what it boils down to. So the symbolic role of Hollywood represents the collective ego, rewarding performance, punishing wholeness, right? Preferring the mask to the truth. This makes Simon's struggle existential and not professional. So the show is layering it as his struggles of being an actor, but his struggles are really existential. It has to do with his whole life. We can understand how vital this is to life because we know, especially as Black people, we know how things can come or what difficult things can come with truly being seen or noticed for who or what you really are, right? The absence of a traditional villain was very purposefully done within this show. This is why this is a different show. It's a Marvel show with no villain. And that's very easy to miss how significant that is, right? There's no clear bad guy because the antagonist is perception, contracts, expectations, internalized fear, right? And it's signaling this tonal shift for the MCU because we're moving into that mutant saga. That next phase is not about defeating evil, it has to do with surviving systems. So this is priming the audience for mutants again. This is what this whole show has been about. Right? So it's priming the audience for mutants whose greatest enemies has always been society itself. We know this, right? We've all seen X-Men. We all grew up watching the X-Men cartoon. It was always about them trying to control the mutants, right? So when Simon finally gets to the point where he stops trying to manage how he is seen, that's when his performance improves. That's when his energy changes and when people begin to respond to him differently. And it's because he can now be present because he is not stuck in his mind trying to make sure that he keeps part of himself hidden. It's allowing him to be able to be present. All right. See, authenticity isn't louder. It doesn't make you louder. It makes you steadier. And that's what the show is really showing you. Right. So it doesn't really hit that crucial moment until he finds out the truth about Trevor, right? Until he finds out that Trevor's really working for the Department of Damage Control, right? He's really been out to get him because, mind you, his whole life, Simon hasn't had very many friends. He hasn't had very many people in his corner for this very reason, because of the nature of who he is, because of his powers. So now it's like the one person that I let in is actually somebody that's been sent here to destroy me. And in that instance, he goes to that studio, he loses control. And then we get the evolution of Trevor's character in him taking on the role of the Mandarin, which he already is established to the public. Everywhere he go, everybody's always saying, aren't you the Mandarin? So in everybody's mind, he's already the Mandarin. So it's not hard for people to believe this. So he puts that role back on in order to save Simon because of the outburst. He destroyed the whole studio. Right? So he took it on for him to give him the chance. Remember, they're basically on the opposite ends of their journey, right? Trevor has lived the life of an actor. He's been an actor and he's made a lot of mistakes. We've seen this all throughout his character throughout the MCU. And in this moment, he gets a sense of redemption in what he does for Simon, right? So every key moment in the show really reinforces the same truth. You're not your wound. You're not your power. You're not your mask. Even in terms of Trevor, it relates because he constantly has to fight the idea of being the Mandarin in itself, So this is the thing about Wonder Man. This is why it's such a shift in the MCU, because it brings it back down to a human level, to a personal level that we can all pretty much kind of relate to, and this is what this show is really doing. It's a grounded show that's not based in the spectacle of grand costumes or coloring or action scenes or explosive powers. It's about someone just being a person, but he just so happens to have powers, right? So it was a powerful, amazing show. I enjoyed it a lot. It Wonder Man isn't failing to be a superhero show. It's preparing us for a world where real conflict isn't good versus evil. It's authenticity versus safety. And not every story is going to entertain. Some are meant to tell the truth. Some just do it so well that they also entertain you while giving you truth. So, that's a wrap on Wonder Man. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to seeing Wonder Man in future MCU projects. I hope this isn't the last we see of him. And I'm glad that they chose to release this show. Now, we feel a ways We feel a ways because it often feels like Disney, Marvel, MCU, those big wigs don't really show a lot of care to those black projects, your Iron Hearts, right? And things of that nature, which we could say, we could really argue that that is absolutely the case. So I won't argue with anybody about that point. It does feel like those projects doesn't get as much notoriety, as much marketing, as much attention. Um, is that purposefully? Is it because of the nature or the climate or the environment of the world we live in? Maybe so. Who knows? But ultimately, I thought it was well done. Just I thought Ironheart was well done as well, but So what I say is, if we want to support these projects, we should watch them. We should encourage others to watch them, right? So that they can get the same type of publicity and notoriety, right? Because contrary to popular belief, the unconscious of the masses really tends to push certain narratives and things of that nature. So when you get heavily black led projects, when you get heavily feminine led projects, you're gonna get a lot of blowback from the public because subconsciously they misogynistic, and and they just don't feel comfortable with certain truths. We're not gonna deny that. We're not gonna deny that at all. That is what it is. So watch Wonder Man. Encourage others to watch Wonder Man. So with that, I'm out. That's a wrap on Wonder Man. I appreciate y'all for tapping in. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know what else y'all want me to touch on. I've been thinking about touching on a lot of MCU projects as of late, because we're getting so much talk about MCU, and it's just January and we don't get Doomsday until December. So I can only imagine how much or how consistent this MCU talk is going to be for the remainder of the year. And not to mention, we got Spider-Man coming out in the summertime, right? So we got Daredevil season 2 coming out. So I'm curious and interested to see how this thing goes, because I'm very fond of the comic book stories because I understand the layering that's in them. So I appreciate y'all. Drop any comments you have below. I'll see y'all next time. Peace.